Raab is standing by, Deputy Prime Minister. Is the answer to privatise the Passport Office?
I think the point the Prime Minister made, and he made it again last night, is that we're neutral on the question of who does the provision. What we're not neutral on, and what we want to see is the service to the taxpayer and to the public being the very best value for money. And therefore, if we need to consider changing the controller of a particular service, that's something that we're willing to do. But I don't think a decision's been taken either way on it. But of course, you're right. Of course, as a result of the pandemic, there's a backlog in all sorts of areas of public administration, including passports. We're driving as fast as we can to bear down on that. And we, of course, understand the position that holidaymakers are in and want to be able to plan and want to be able to go away.
Mr. Raab, as Simon Calder said, this comes as a surprise to the Passport Office and the Home Office. It doesn't come to us as a surprise to anyone else that was going to be this backlog.
Well, I don't think that's correct. I think the pandemic has created all sorts of burdens on businesses, but also on public sector delivery. There are all sorts of things we're applying for, which where they still, because the staff have been limited, or because they've been working from home, or for other reasons, and there are backlogs, and of course that's inevitably the consequence of coming through a pandemic of this scale. But we're bearing down on those backlogs right across the field, including in relation to passports, and we do understand the frustration holidaymakers will have.
I've got to say that, Mr. Raab, I would think if you had responsibility at the Ministry of Justice for these matters, you might have called a meeting last summer and said to your civil servants, guys, we need to make sure we're ready for a surge in passport applications next spring when the travel restrictions lift. Isn't the job of ministers to see ahead and plan for these things? And don't you think that's what you would have done if you were in charge of this policy area?
I can tell you're a former Labour politician, Ed, but look, of course, we want to try and look ahead, preempt and mitigate the risks that we've got. But we would still have backlogs in various different areas. The idea that we'd come through a pandemic on this scale and it would all be seamless and we'd just get back to normal, I don't think is realistic. When you look at the range of burdens, again, people can see it in their own lives, in the private sector, families up and down the country, but of course on the administration of public services. The key thing is that we maximise the push to get those services provided, and we bear down on it as fast and as swiftly and as effectively as we can. And I'm doing that in the Ministry of Justice, as you kindly say, and the Home Secretary is doing across the board in the Home Office. They're different departments. They've got different challenges.
Are you one of those who, in the meeting that was called yesterday to discuss ideas to deal with the cost of living crisis, which, again, to most people has come as no surprise. Are you one of those who wants the Chancellor to cut taxes? Are you one of those who wants MOTs to be done every 2 years rather than every year? Are you one of those who wants to relax health and safety regulations on childcare providers to cut costs?
Well, I think, first of all, to address your point squarely, the idea that inflation would spike over the course of the next year, so it'll be relatively temporary, but by the amount that it has, that is a part and parcel of the aftershocks of the pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine. The idea that these were all eminently foreseeable things, I don't think is right or fair. But what we're doing about it is a £22 billion package of support on energy bills, on council tax, the national living wage, the universal credit taper. And now in government, we're looking at the whole range of other things that we can do. I'm not going to start commenting on the details of cabinet discussions, but what I would say is if you look, and I know this is a father of young children, things like childcare costs, that's something where we've got a huge offer, but the take-up of it hasn't been as much as we want to see. So we've got to advertise that and see if we can go further. Housing costs, of course, are a big issue as well. So Michael Gove is looking at that. So we'll look at all of these areas across the board on top of that £22 billion package of support that we've already put in place.
When we were last talking on this programme, Mr. Raab, which I think was back at the end of January, back then we were talking about a number of issues, including back then what was happening to inflation and to energy prices, and that was 5 or 6 weeks before the budget.
Exactly.
Does it slightly feel as though you had the cabinet discussion on the cost of living a bit late? And were you one of those people who, in retrospect, or maybe prospectively, agreed with other colleagues of yours in Parliament that the national insurance tax rise planned last year turned out to be poorly timed? I know there's a number of people who think it should have been postponed, including in the cabinet. Were you one of those voices?
Well, first of all, we have cabinet discussions on the cost of living very regularly in subcommittees of cabinet that look at it. And as I said, we've got a 22 billion package of support, but it's right, we continue to look at other areas. The one thing I wouldn't do, and I don't even think the previous Blairite governments would do, is have a windfall tax on oil and gas, because, as you know, it would hike bills and cut supply and investment in supply, particularly for transitional measures as we go through these difficult times.
Although the Labour government had a windfall tax in 1997, the Conservative government had a windfall tax on the banks in 1980-81. That's not a party political issue. It's something you do when there's been a big hike in prices and profits and you want to deliver something for consumers. Is it really such a bad idea?
Well, sorry, Ed, I think your political credentials are coming out. I think it's a crazy idea.
It was a Conservative party which did it in 1980-81. It was something Geoffrey Howe did on the banks in 1980-81.
Is this a party political broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party?
I think Geoffrey Howe was a Conservative Chancellor, Mr Raab. I mean, you know, you've got to put the record straight there, but a Conservative Chancellor decided to have a windfall tax on the banks. That's not a Labour idea, it's a Conservative idea.
Let me put it squarely to you. Whenever a Labour government has been in office, unemployment has finished higher than when it began. I would put it to you that the handling of the economic crisis was disastrous, left us with sky-high unemployment, a massive deficit, and what the wrong thing to do when we're trying to protect hard-pressed consumers watching this show is to make the problem worse. And attacking oil and gas in the North Sea when we need that supply of energy to prevent, to maintain supply and to prevent bills going up, I think is clearly reckless. I don't think the Labour Party currently has got a plan.
I was just asking you about David Davis and John Redwood and Kit Malthouse all saying that the Conservative Party at the moment ought to be not going ahead with the national insurance tax rise. That's not a party political thing. It's actually about the debate happening within your own party. I just wondered whether you agreed with Mr Malthouse in the cabinet yesterday, or did you sit on your hands?
As you know, I wouldn't comment on cabinet discussions, but I think it's a glorious day when Ed Balls is championing John Redwood and David Davis, and we should have more of them.
Mr Raab, currently working people have to cope with that NI rise. You've already cut universal credit by £1,000 a year. You say that we shouldn't be attacking the energy companies, but it's, you know, people at the lower end of the scale are having to face hundreds of pounds increase in their energy bills. And now we've got food price inflation, which means that one research organisation says that food prices are going to go up by £300 on average per year. How are people supposed to cope?
I totally understand. The first thing to say is we've got to have the economy firing on all cylinders. We've got the fastest growing economy in the G7 this year. Unemployment is back down to pre-pandemic levels. That's crucial. But I totally understand your point that you can be in work but still struggle to make ends meet. That's why the universal credit taper reforms were put in place. As you said, they will save those qualifying £1,000 a year. The increases in the national living wage will save a further £1,000 a year for those that qualify. And we're taking a range of other measures, the rebate on council tax and energy bills, to provide that support. We've got to, though, and I think this is crucial, take a half step back and see that the big thing we need is the investment coming into the economy. We've seen that. I could give you two examples. Amazon Prime video streaming services, the new headquarters they're setting up in Shepherd. Ola, the Indian firm, setting up an R&D facility for electric batteries in Coventry. These are the investments into the UK economy that will drive jobs, but also create the...
That's the trouble, isn't it? Well, and without, you know, picking holes in the figures, you know, people are feeling it. And the trouble is, the people who are really feeling it feel like you guys at the top aren't feeling it in the same way.
But Susanna, I have addressed, for example, the range of measures that we've taken to protect consumers, the UC £1,000, the national living wage, that's a further £1,000, the other measures. But I was just making the broader point that we need to be short-term relief for consumers in exactly the way that you described, but also making sure that the economy, the fundamentals are there, that we've got the investment coming in. And I gave you two great examples where jobs are coming in, but also the investment that will create the jobs, the livelihoods, and pay the wages for those people to help them make ends meet. We shouldn't lose sight of those fundamentals that we're putting in place because we've got a plan. Frankly, I don't think Keir Starmer's got a plan. I think he's reaching for knee-jerk solutions that may have a populist appeal, but will actually do more harm than good.
Dominic Raab, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.